Metafix is a show that teaches you how to think in the metagame. I am not here to give you the answers, nor am I going to tell you how to win. Metafix teaches you how to play in the metagame and how to react around the metagame and what is in the metagame. If you're looking for the answers, try HC Realms, check the forums, they have all kinds of neat toys and tools and teams being brought up, and check the results of a lot of the ROC tournaments or any Worlds tournaments to see how teams played out and what teams were used for. I'm just here to help you think.
Play the game on paper. I want to thank our patrons for deciding on an episode to do for this particular month and for their support. And as I go into this, I've realized this episode is a lot to bite off. But I'm not going to do what you think I'm going to do. I'm not going to go over a map in detail. I'm going to point out a few key maps as far as the use of maps in the game. And I'm going to kind of future-proof this episode as we go. So, the first thing I want to mention is, yes, the map is one of the most important things in the game. When I last did this episode, I didn't have a high opinion of them, but we were waiting on 6 months of War of Light to change my mind about that. So now that I've caught my breath after the 6 months, the map can make or break a team. And that's part of something you need to start paying attention to when you're practicing and building your team. When you're, now, when it comes to events, sometimes at a local event, which is not what I suggest using your tools and tricks that you learn here at, but at bigger events, you'll get to choose your map for your game. Especially at rock events, you actually get a choice or get to bring 3 maps. You're limited to 3, and that is individual sides of each map. Now, I could spend hours going over each and every map that's in the current modern age, but in a couple months, that will make this episode obsolete. So what I want to do is at the time of filming, just give you guys an idea of something that's probably going to change. Right now, this is the collection of modern age maps. Now, my estimation that come July, this plus maybe this will look like our collection of maps. So when I do this episode, you have to understand that things are probably going to change very drastically between now and when you might be watching this next year if you happen to catch it after July. So what I want to do is I want to go over what you need to think about when going over a map. Now, currently in the modern game, I look at one map and say, can your team operate on this map? And that is Ryut. Now, why do I say Ryut? Even if you go forward in time, and Ryut doesn't exist as a map, Ryut is an outdoor map that contains 6 elevations of elevated terrain, and the map is almost 100% of this elevated terrain. So you think to yourself, well, if this map doesn't exist, why do I have to consider it? You have to consider it for one major reason. Ignore elevated terrain for line of fire and movement exists. And especially for movement, when you consider that flyers have it, some characters get it from their improved movement, leap and climb gives it, and phasing gives it. So you have to understand going into a tournament, especially one of the major ones, that Ryut, I consider the base model is, if you can't move in Ryut, you can't move. You have to be able to be flexible with your movements. Now, the second most important map to take into consideration, and this is another War of Light one nonetheless, and it's going to be harder for me to find because I haven't memorized that map and haven't used it as frequently as anything else in the game, but that is the Black Mercy Gardens. Now, the reason for that is it's not evidenced at first glance, because there's a ton of hindering terrain on that map. But it's all orange terrain. Now, the orange terrain has an effect on the game that in the future, I don't know which map it's behind. Anyway, which means in the future you got to consider how does your team move around or through and operate with the existence of hindering terrain. And that's what it comes down to is I can't tell you what map your team is going to use. It's a very difficult process because you have to look at the contents of your team, the requirements of your range, and how your team functions if it's able to ignore certain elements of the map. Now, with that said, you gotta look at your team and you look at your opponent's team. Because this is an important fact that a lot of people go into competition not knowing. When it comes to the start of the game, when you first reveal your teams to each other. That's the first step. And one of the reasons for this step, revealing your team actually shows your opponent that at build, your team was the theme team, right? You kind of have to prove it and show it to people to evidence it that it's a theme team and understand how your team functions. And then once you understand how your opponent's team functions, you get to choose a map based on your team and their team. Now, things to look for are how well can they move in certain types of situations. How much range and line of fire do you need, and what kinds of lines of fire can you ignore? And these are all the elements that you have to think about when choosing your map, especially against your opponent. If your opponent has a ton of stealth and you can't ignore it, you got to look for a map that doesn't have a lot of hindering terrain for them to rely on. If you ignore hindering terrain, then it really doesn't matter. So you look to the team and say they're stealthy, but can they move through that hindering terrain well? Another question you have to kind of look at when you're choosing a map in competitive play. As well, you got to look to how much blocking terrain there is versus the line of fire you need. Are you a close combat team? It might be worth it to make sure your opponent can't draw a line of fire to you. So that's where I consider Ryut one of those important teams when it comes to this kind of thought process. Is Ryut is good for teams that rely on close combat or ignore elevated for line of fire or even movement, because your opponent in a lot of cases isn't going to be able to see your team in a lot of situations. Elevating terrain is a gigantic blocker to lines of fire and to movement. Now, granted, you got your little triangles to move around it and move within its ranges, but really that only gets you to a certain degree. Now, if you have a team that relies on a lot of knockback, you got to make sure you're stopping those movements or knocking people off of buildings. I mentioned that because currently in the game, the lowest lane Red Tornado, or the uncommon Red Tornado from Superman Wonder Woman, has traded knockback, and she's able to pop it off twice in a turn. And if you can keep the character adjacent to you, that can go a long way. Or if you knock them off of elevated terrain with your free action, then free action sidestep to the other side of them and knock them back into that elevated terrain, they'll have to be stopping their movement, which will deal further knockback damage and will further keep them next to you. You can really get a lot of damage out of that character just by simply rolling a d6 and just putting them in the direction that you want to put them. So using the map to your advantage goes as well as picking the map to your advantage. And that's where I like the ROC's limit of 3 maps. Now, WizKids doesn't use this. You've got the full gamut of maps. If you have a map, pull it out of your bag. And that's for major events such as Nationals, Worlds, Canadian Nationals, etc. They don't limit your maps. They don't make you rate your maps on your team thing. But with that said, if you're limited in a ROC event or an ROC event, you've got to choose very carefully. Is it more important for your map to beat your opponent, or is it more important for your map to help you? Sometimes there are maps that can help you with the terrain. If you have a very stealth-heavy team and you can use that to your advantage against your opponent, choose that heavy hindering terrain map. If you've got the ability to ignore blocking for movement, get ready for some burst fire and choose an indoor map such as Hank Pym's Lab. These are the things that take into deep consideration when it comes to map choice. But again, when I'm doing this episode, you've got options, and some of these options are wild. You've got massive elevated terrain maps and small indoor maps here and there, but ultimately, when we get to this point, if you're watching this episode, things will have changed, but there's still some choices in this that have a lot of the options that I'm talking about. So, this is one of those things when we follow the format of the Metafix, and I don't give you all the answers, and I give you the thought process to get them. This is the best way to think about a map. Now, sometimes you don't own a map, and I'm going to put a link down below to a site that does have mock-ups of all the maps that do exist, so you do get an idea of maps that you might play against. If you're limited in what you have, make sure you build with what you have in mind, and think about how often you're going to play or you're going to win map roll with your team. Because one of the things of controlling the map roll is you only get to control it with a theme team. And it's even with a theme and 300 points of 4 characters, against a team without a theme, you're still not guaranteed to win. Trust me, it's happened to me. It's an active issue that actually exists. So be aware that it doesn't work perfectly all the time. Also understand too that Just because you pick the map that's great against your opponent doesn't stop you from having to play well. You do have to play out the team and understand your angles, understand your positioning in order to still be victorious with your team. Because sometimes, if you leave too much open space on a map and you think you can take advantage of it, sometimes your opponent has something that you didn't quite think of, like big TK bomb, some kind of character with a massive charge range that you might have missed. Try to be aware of what your opponent can do as much as what you can do, and that goes for all play. So with that said, that's been my episode on maps. I want to get in, take a chance to thank the patrons for deciding on this episode. And remember, if you want to support us at patreon.com/Heroclix, you do at any level get a chance to vote on the topics that we cover and nominate a topic that you want to consider for an episode. With that said, always remember, guys, when it comes to map choice and building your team, practice makes your team better.
The opinions and thoughts brought to you in Metafix are not meant for the casual game at the table.
Married with Clicks is brought to you in part by MajesticCCG.com. Check out the new premium site with MajesticCCG.com/Apex-Insiders. Check the link below. Trust me. Trying to remember that from me talking? Not going to help. You'll get awesome articles at $3 a month, with the first month being free, from amazing writers such as Paris Gordon, Easton Brock, Aaron Cantu. I'm even going to be contributing occasionally. And if you're familiar with the Meta Lab, check out some of Mike Payne's articles. So check it out again, MajesticCCG.com/Apex-Insiders for your look into the minds of some of the greats.